So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of the very handsome book, Mediterranean Diasporas, Politics and Ideas in the Long 19th Century. It's a lovely day in Paris, but nonetheless it's midwinter and it's a great pleasure at this time of year to think about the Mediterranean. And so our plan is, let me just say that my name is Keith Baker and I teach at Stanford University, and I'm a fellow this year at the Institute for Advanced Study here in Paris. So our plan then is to ask the editors of the book to talk for a few minutes about why they got this enterprise going and what they hope to achieve from it. And then we'll ask our panelists, our designated panelists, to make some remarks to which the editors may wish to reply. And after that, we'll open the floor for general discussion. So let me then just very briefly introduce the editors of the volume. Konstantina Zanou, who of course is the moving spirit between this particular within this particular event. She is a fellow also at the Institute for Advanced Study here in Paris, and it's been a great pleasure to get to know her here. She will be joining Columbia University as an assistant professor in next fall, 2016, in the Department of Italian, specializing in Mediterranean studies. In addition to this volume, she's published a number of articles on expatriate intellectuals and national consciousness in the post-Venetian Adriatic. She's just completed a new book, Stammering the Nation, Transnational Patriotism in the Mediterranean, 1800 to 1830, which is currently under review. And
it's forthcoming.
It's forthcoming. Congratulations. Brava. That's great. And she's now working on her new project, Global Italians, the Cesnola brothers between the Mediterranean and the Americas in the long 19th century. And I'll introduce both of the editors, or actually each of the editors, and then I'll leave it up to them to decide on how they want to present the volume. So, Maurizio Isabella is a senior lecturer in modern history at Queen Mary, University of London. I gather it's now just called Queen Mary London. But, he's written about 19th century Italian and Southern European political and economic culture. He's interested particularly in the transnational circulation of ideas. He's the author of a book published in 2009, Risorgimento in Exile, Italian Emigre and the Liberal International in the Post-Napoleonic Era. And he's currently working on a history of the 1820s revolutions in Southern Europe, from Portugal to Greece, putting that range of revolutions in a global context. So, editors, please.
Thank you very much. I will start and Maurizio will continue. I would like to thank you all for being here, and of course the panelists for accepting to participate here. And I would like to thank especially the people of the Institut de Provence, not only for helping me organizing this, but also for creating this little paradise here for researchers and visitors, and I'm sure he agrees in this. So before giving the floor to the discussants, I would like to say two words about the way this book was perceived and how it was created. So we were both brought together with Maurizio some years ago, first because of our characters, second because of our shared interests, research interests, which were concentrated around intellectual issues so intellectual history of the 19th century, and especially we were both historians working with exile and displacement, concentrating on the circulation of ideas, and especially on the way national consciousness was formed from a position of distance. Okay. So this book came into being through 3 conferences that we organized in Nicosia, Cyprus, and in London. But the book is not actually the proceedings of the conference. It's rather the conferences worked in creating a forum of discussion where this book managed to take place, to appear, to come into being. It created a forum from people of different subject areas. This was the most important thing. At the beginning, we didn't think of the Mediterranean. The geographical framework of the project was not really clear. It became clear throughout the years as we gradually realized 2 things. First, that as an area of inquiry, the 19th century Mediterranean intellectual history did not exist. And second, that the divisions, disciplinary and geographical, between 19th century specialists did not make any sense. The disciplinary divisions by nation state do not make sense for the period that we study at least. But the geographical setting has influenced this process in another way. Seeing history from the perspective of Cyprus, what East and West are becomes meaningless. And also, if you come from a place like me, from a place like Cyprus, where failed nationalists, unrecognized states within other exceptional states, post-colonial military bases in international neutral zones, all these try to find accommodation under the roof of a post-national federation, then you cannot but see the Mediterranean history as a sum of statelets and protectorates, which is far from the conventional story of the triumph of nation-state.
Yes, I will just add very few additional words to what Konstantina has said, and I would like to join her in thanking very warmly the Institut d'Études Avancées for having allowed us to organize this event, and I wanted to thank also Keith Baker for chairing it and the discussants, and also wanted to remind the audience that we have luckily at least one of the authors of this edited volume, Grégoire Braun, who wrote a brilliant chapter on the relationship between the Italian peninsula and the Iberian Peninsula in the long 19th century, and the impact that these connections had on liberalism. So I think, thinking about where we were when we started conceiving this project and what we think we have achieved at the end of it, one of the, I think, most striking thing, at least from our perspective, of mine and Konstantina, is that we started questioning the intellectual foundations and the nature of the nation as we had thought it existed at the beginning of our project. And in fact, at the end of the project, the 19th century looked less like the century of the rise of the nation states, and more a century where a number of different political communities were conceived and tried out in different sort of political, macro-political context. And so, if one thing that perhaps this book offers is the idea of the 19th century no longer as the century of the nation state, but the century of a plurality of political communities. And this is the result, we think, of a specific methodological choice of the volume that also came out of the discussions of the conferences, that is a combination between a biographical approach and an intellectual history approach. It's only by studying the individual intellectual trajectory of people who keep changing their mind about what they should do in future in sort of continuously changing political context that we came to understand the multiplicity of possibilities that existed in the 19th century, and also the possibilities that faded, that failed, and why and when they failed. So it is a book, we think, about the movement of people, but also the changing of ideas in time, in a moment, in a historical period that is a period of great and sudden changes, if you think about what happens in the Mediterranean in the 19th century. And so it became, we think, a book and a collection also about the Mediterranean in the age of revolution, and a book about liberalism in the Mediterranean. And it is one that I think fundamentally challenges what traditionally has considered the Mediterranean as a periphery, and is trying to consider the Mediterranean as a center, no longer as a periphery. I think these are in a nutshell, what we think we are trying to do with this collection. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you both. And so we will ask our commentators to make some remarks. And the first one will be Wolfgang Kaiser. He's Professor of Early Modern History at Paris-Stanford, at the Sorbonne. He's Director d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. And his focus of research and publications is on the early modern Mediterranean. He directs the ERC-funded research project, Mediterranean Reconfigurations, Commercial Litigation, Intercultural Trade, Legal Pluralism in Historical Perspective from the 15th to the 19th century. He's explored the history of the Mediterranean in a number of very significant ways. A book, Gens de passage en Méditerranée, de l'Antiquité à l'époque moderne, which explores procedures of control and identification, written with Claudia Moatti. He's written on the commerce des captifs, intermediaries in the exchange and repurchasing of prisoners in the Mediterranean in the early modern period. He's co-written a volume on Muslims in European history. He has written a book on spatial dimensions of mercantile practices in the Mediterranean, and most recently, moving towards the theme of this book, a publication with some colleagues, Union and Separation, Diasporic Groups and Identities in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Bon, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je suis un peu hésitant dans quelle langue on procède.
Français.
Ça va?
C'est votre choix.
Bon. Enfin, je suis même obligé, fonctionnaire français que je suis, dans un lieu comme ça.
Voilà.
C'est peut-être un bâton qui me semble cela. Bon, je défends mon nom aussi. Kaiser s'écrit pas avec un Y mais avec un I. J'y tiens parce qu'il y a un célèbre germaniste, Wolfgang Kaiser, das sprachliche Kunstwerk, qui a été fortement compromis avec les nazis. Et je tiens à la différence. Bon, je fais ça depuis plusieurs décennies déjà. Donc je suis, on a 10 minutes.
Bah oui.
Donc je vais essayer de faire. Je suis de toute manière peut-être le plus périphérique parmi les collègues qui ont été sollicités par Konstantina de dire quelques mots sur l'ouvrage, parce que moi-même je travaille sur la Méditerranée, mais plutôt dans les wild times, du 15e au 17e siècle. La fragilité européenne saute en quelque sorte aussi, c'est ça que m'intéresse dans des thématiques que Heyberger a esquissées dans son introduction. Donc j'ai lu l'ouvrage de taille humaine, déjà ça va très bien, avec beaucoup d'intérêt, j'ai beaucoup appris et je vais essayer de donner quelques impressions de lecture fraîche aussi. en ce qui concerne l'ouvrage et qui touche à des problématiques que nous discutons quand même dans un cycle depuis au moins désormais 5 ans à l'école normale supérieure, un séminaire que j'avais lancé avec Gilles Pécou, qui s'appelle Penser la Méditerranée à l'époque moderne et contemporaine, qui essaie de casser la frontière chronologique et disciplinaire aussi, et qui essaie de réfléchir sur la construction de la Méditerranée comme objet dans les sciences humaines et sociales, donc en quelque sorte au deuxième degré aussi. Certains sont déjà venus intervenir dans le séminaire ici, donc en quelque sorte on est dans une continuité de l'échange. Donc maintenant à l'ouvrage, donc il y a en quelque sorte une figure intellectuelle du libéral international qui traverse l'ouvrage comme concept d'approche. Et il y a aussi, pas partout, mais explicitement donné à quelques endroits, un lien établi avec cette figure internationale libérale, avec le processus de globalisation, normalement dans l'ouvrage aussi lié aux travaux de Christopher Bailey, qui a eu droit à des remerciements dans l'ouvrage aussi, qui n'est pas, à mon sens, argumenté dans l'ouvrage, parce que ce n'est pas au centre, évidemment. Je trouve que c'est même en partie un peu en contradiction avec les résultats des différents morceaux, des différents chapitres, des différentes contributions. Donc je reviendrai là-dessus. Donc Globalizing Process, un certain nombre de critères donnés, mais qui sont donnés de manière universaliste en quelque sorte. Là j'ai un problème, mais c'est peut-être le défaut des modernistes qui travaillent sur le bas Moyen-Âge et la première modernité, d'avoir des problèmes avec des concepts aussi globalisants. Elle est le résultat, donc je cite Grégoire Brand, d'une cohorte d'historiens. Donc il y a un groupe qui essaie de mettre en question la vision traditionnelle de la formation de l'État-nation, etc. Ça vient d'être dit, et qui m'a paru, à la lecture d'un trait de l'ouvrage, vraiment un groupe relativement compact. J'ai ce défaut professionnel aussi, je regarde les footnotes. On pourrait faire dans le petit jeu aussi, on couvre les notes de bas de page et on demande aux autres quels sont les auteurs qui devraient être cités. Et je crois dans une bonne partie des notes, on voit les gens arriver. Il y a évidemment, je comprends le jeu, les impact factors, etc. Et il y a aussi, en quelque sorte, c'est le résultat aussi d'une discussion intellectuelle entre vous, intéressant, et ça a donné quand même, en quelque sorte, un fil rouge dans l'ouvrage argumentatif assez impressionnant et intéressant. Donc maintenant, l'ouvrage, à mon avis, aurait pu d'ailleurs s'intituler comme ça, Mediterranean Itineraries. Donc il y a une approche très forte à la biographie, de manière intéressante, si vous regardez les publications sur Global Microhistory. Il y a un retour de la biographie, de l'approche biographique, ou de suivre les acteurs historiques à travers les étapes de leur vie, carrière, etc., avec une contextualisation plus ou moins forte dans chaque endroit, place. Donc ça, je ne sais pas, c'est pas thématisé de manière méthodologique, etc. Je ne sais pas. Est-ce que c'est conscient? Est-ce que c'est en quelque sorte une démarche qui, naturellement, dans la faisabilité de ce qu'on fait, c'est donné. Donc ça donne donc toute une série de biographies intellectuelles, culturelles très intéressantes. Puis il y a le thème quand même de la Southern Liberty qui est traité avec ces liens entre l'exil mais aussi les échanges entre les deux péninsules, etc. une belle définition des Mediterranean liberals comme imperial subjects engaged in transnational disputes. Donc, comme définition en quelque sorte à partir du caractère de leur interaction. On peut cependant évidemment se poser la question si c'est vraiment une notion forte de Southern Liberty, parce que parmi les découvertes, je dois l'avouer de manière tout à fait néophyte, naïve, etc., on pourrait lire l'ouvrage aussi à travers des figures intellectuelles qui traversent le livre et apparaissent en filigrane. C'est aussi un livre collectif sur quelqu'un comme Jeremy Bentham qui apparaît à plusieurs reprises, ou Edward Blaquière, que je ne connaissais pas. Donc c'est cette littérature des Letters on Barbary, France, Portugal, Spain, Letters on the Mediterranean, toute cette littérature qui aurait peut-être pu gagner davantage aussi si on regarde un peu le monde germanophone. Donc il y a Heyberger qui apparaît, mais bon, c'est un peu juste. Il y a là une tradition, pas dans le philhellénisme, mais tout simplement l'intérêt pour le Midi, pour l'invention du Sud. Il y a un très beau texte de oui, mais ça va dans tous les sens et c'est lié aussi à l'époque, en partie à l'époque révolutionnaire. Il y a les fabricants, des gens, les révolutionnaires qui ont été vaincus pour leur vie, qui écrivent des voyages fictifs en Provence, dans le midi de la France, etc. Et il y a des gens qui réellement y vont, évidemment. Et Heyberger, en quelque sorte, un renvoi à cette tradition, mais bon, on ne peut pas tout faire, etc. Je le dis tout simplement parce que pour certains de vos personnages, il y a des parcours qui intègrent le nord, enfin, le sud de l'Allemagne, comme Tübingen, Strasbourg, et d'autres villes de l'Europe ultramontane, vue de la Méditerranée. Et donc, ce qui apparaît donc, dans ces figures intellectuelles en filigrane comme Jeremy Bentham, c'est en quelque sorte un intérêt qui vient des lumières anglaises pour cette région-là, et qui ne sont pas nécessairement quelque sorte de la Southern Liberty, mais j'ai appris même qu'il y avait un projet de Jeremy Bentham discuté en coopération avec un autre personnage sur lequel Ian Collar a écrit un très très beau chapitre, Suna Dies, quelqu'un de Tripoli qui a fait une carrière en Europe, dans l'Empire ottoman, en Afrique du Nord, sous la dynastie des Karamanlis, etc. Donc on est là, pour moi, en quelque sorte, un argument très fort de penser la Méditerranée comme un espace de circulation, mais lié, qui va jusqu'à Londres, en quelque sorte, à l'Angleterre. Et comment vous définissez ce constat, cette situation? Parce qu'en même temps, dans le chapitre de Ian Collar, on va apparaître une critique des principes universalistes de ces hommes des Lumières, spécialistes d'écrire des projets ou voir des constitutions entières, qui pour les personnages secondaires me rappellent beaucoup pour l'espace germanophone, les travaux sur le Radical Enlightenment de Martin Mulso, ces projets de Schmid, forgerons de projets dans les Allemagnes du XVIIIe siècle qui ont des projets les plus radicaux dans leur tiroir, qui n'ont jamais vu la lumière, mais comme forme d'existence intellectuelle aussi. Alors, est-ce qu'on est là, en quelque sorte, dans un shared world, un monde partagé, oui. Et dans quel sens? Parce que ce qui est intéressant, je trouve, c'est quand même après les différences. Si on s'intéresse les jeunes ottomanistes, qui sont le thème de notre chapitre, ou ces projets pour Tripoli, etc., on est quand même dans une situation où les auteurs qui s'y connaissent se distinguent des principes universalistes en introduisant les coutumes, les traditions, le poids de l'islam, moi je regarde, enfin, j'ai réagi à ce que j'ai pu lire. Donc c'est une autre question qui me paraît intéressante. Et je termine sur un dernier aspect. En fait, ce n'est même pas des itinéraires méditerranéens pour les acteurs, et ce n'est même pas en quelque sorte un confinement à un monde méditerranéen, parce que les aspects les plus intéressants dans certaines contributions sont les liens avec les Atlantic Revolutions, la question du Brésil, qui donne une ambiguïté plus accentuée et intéressante aux carrières et à la pensée de ces auteurs, si je pense au projet de recoloniser les Portugais, le Brésil qu'on avait perdu, donc, avec les principes de libéraux, universalistes, etc. C'est assez cocasse presque. Et de l'autre côté, pour l'Empire ottoman, on peut dire la même chose. Donc on a en quelque sorte une démonstration empirique dans l'histoire intellectuelle que cette Méditerranée est en fait un espace construit, mais selon la perspective sur cet espace, est tiraillé vers des espaces extra-européens aussi. On peut dire la même chose pour l'Empire ottoman et les liens Égypte, Asie, Océanie. Donc là aussi, il y a une problématisation qui n'est pas en quelque sorte explicitement dans les détails développés dans l'ouvrage, mais qui fait une des qualités de votre travail. Bon, je m'arrête là, j'étais déjà un peu long. Le reste, je le dirai peut-être dans la discussion.
Merci beaucoup. Our next speaker is Bernard Heyberger. He's a historian and an Arabist. He's presently director d'études at the Institut en Sciences Sociales, also at the École des Études in the section Sciences Religieuses. He focuses on Christianity in the Ottoman Empire, especially the Arab-speaking Eastern Christians, an issue which of course has a lot to do with circulation, connections and interactions across the Mediterranean. He leads with Wolfgang Kaiser the seminar that Professor Kaiser mentioned, Pensée à la Méditerranée, at the École Normale Supérieure. His main publications are Les Chrétiens du Proche-Orient au temps de la réforme catholique, Hindia, mystique et criminel, 1720 jusqu'à 1798, appeared in Arabic translation in 2011, in English translation in 2013, and most recently he has translated and edited the travelogue of a Syrian around the Mediterranean, Hannah Diab d'Alep à Paris. Thank you.
Bon, je vais continuer en français, parce que j'ai ouvert la porte. Alors, j'ai reconnu dans ce livre pas mal d'approches et de questions méthodologiques qui me concernent personnellement. Moi aussi, j'ai beaucoup tourné autour de figures individuelles qui circulent dans différents lieux. Et ça permet de saisir des connexions et des interactions dans un monde méditerranéen pluriel, avec aussi peut-être une problématique qu'on retrouve dans ce livre et qui n'est pas complètement résolue. Donc, dans ce Global History on a Small Scale, il y a la question de l'exemplarité des individus qu'on suit. C'est un premier problème. L'autre problème, c'est que le livre postule qu'il y a un rapport entre expérimentation de l'exil dans des lieux spécifiques et évolution de la pensée politique et de l'engagement des individus. Ça paraît évident, mais en même temps, ça reste aussi problématique. Et ça m'a frappé, par exemple, à la lecture de l'article de Kirchner-Weil. Il y a une part de mystère dans le parcours biographique et dans les choix idéologiques des personnages qui ne me paraissent pas complètement résolus et pas complètement expliqués par le simple fait qu'ils aient passé dans différents milieux. Donc il y a un peu une question sur que fait le parcours à la biographie. Ou inversement, en quoi la biographie nous aide à comprendre certaines évolutions idéologiques. Bon, pour ce qui est du cadre méditerranéen, on en a déjà un peu parlé, en tout cas, est-ce qu'il est complètement pertinent? On voit bien que ça déborde un peu, mais ce qui est quand même intéressant de choisir ce cadre, c'est que ça permet de montrer des connexions qui seraient inapparentes autrement. Et ça, c'est quand même déjà pas mal, et comme c'est dit dans le livre, je veux dire, on étudie en général le 19e siècle à partir de cadres nationaux qui n'existent pas encore, donc c'est une espèce de projection en arrière pour étudier des aires culturelles qui sont devenues des aires nationales. Et ici, donc, on arrive avec cette méthode à montrer des connexions intéressantes. Alors, le parcours est entendu dans un sens très physique, les déplacements qui conduisent à des lieux méditerranéens de production du savoir, Padoue, les îles Ioniennes, il y a aussi Istanbul. On voit bien, comme Wolfgang l'a dit, que ces centres méditerranéens ne fonctionnent pas en toute autonomie et que presque tout le monde, à un moment ou à un autre, fait un détour vers le nord et qu'il y a Londres et Paris quand même, ou Moscou, qui sont des centres beaucoup plus attractifs. Mais ce qui m'a intéressé, c'est qu'il y ait encore une géographie intellectuelle méditerranéenne toujours vivante, et en particulier dans l'article de Santina, les chrétiens orthodoxes, essentiellement élévanophones, continuent à circuler dans ce triangle qui est déjà très important depuis le XVIe siècle, qui est le triangle Venise ou Padoue, Moldavie, Valachie et Moscou. Et ça me paraît vraiment quelque chose de très important dans l'émergence d'une conscience identitaire orthodoxe, y compris d'ailleurs chez les Arabes, à partir du XVIIe siècle. Alors, aux exilés politiques évoqués ici, j'ai envie, en lisant le livre, d'ajouter une longue liste d'ecclésiastiques qui circulent sur les mêmes chemins et fréquentent les mêmes centres du XVIIe au XIXe siècle, et sans doute avec une intensification au XIXe. Alors, dans ce livre, il est question des routes par lesquelles passe la pensée libérale, mais je fais l'hypothèse, en pensant à mes ecclésiastiques, que la pensée réactionnaire ou conservatrice emprunte les mêmes chemins. Et je pense par exemple à l'idéalisation de la féodalité et d'une société paysanne théocratique qui sert de socle au nationalisme libanais à partir des années 1840, qui puise chez Lamartine, mais qui puise aussi directement dans les milieux catholiques et légitimistes français. D'ailleurs, l'ouvrage montre les fluctuations de cette pensée libérale et parfois ses accointances avec la réaction. Il y a par exemple le lien avec la mystique politique russe fondée sur des prophéties eschatologiques. J'ai pensé aussi à une autre eschatologie, un autre messianisme qui pénètre en Méditerranée à cette époque, c'est celui des protestants américains, des missionnaires protestants américains qui arrivent vers 1820 et dont l'eschatologie ou le messianisme a cette caractéristique d'être aussi une synthèse entre une pensée religieuse très conservatrice et la pensée des Lumières. Le parcours est aussi compris dans le sens d'une trajectoire de vie, donc d'un itinéraire intellectuel, et on voit que cette époque ouverte par la Révolution française est une époque d'ingénierie politique. On a l'impression que toutes les solutions en matière de tracer des frontières, de construction constitutionnelle sont possibles, mais où les individus sont souvent pris dans des changements imprévisibles qui donnent une nouvelle orientation à leur vie et à leur engagement politique. Et le livre affirme fortement, et ça je trouvais ça très intéressant, affirme fortement qu'il y a trois types de solutions qui continuent à cohabiter dans le XIXe siècle méditerranéen. L'empire à l'ancienne, comme l'empire ottoman, qui peut être considéré comme un modèle de pluralisme culturel et confessionnel au prix de réformes. L'empire colonial, qui peut offrir aussi une forme de gestion du pluralisme en même temps qu'il introduit une dynamique de développement et de civilisation. Et puis la solution nationale qui va l'emporter, mais en fait seulement après la Première Guerre mondiale. Et il faut bien le dire avec le recul, avec des résultats dont la crise de l'ex-Yougoslavie ou la destruction actuelle des États arabes montrent la nocivité. Alors l'échec de l'Empire ottoman a fait émerger une citoyenneté ottomane à faire émerger une citoyenneté ottomane à laquelle, par exemple, croyaient les pères du risorgimento arabe comme Boutros Boustany. Cet échec est imputable aux échecs militaires et économiques de l'Empire, qui a mené à l'exaspération de la partie musulmane de sa population et au démantèlement progressif. Il est dû aussi à la politique de protection des minorités par les grandes puissances, qui était en fait une politique d'ingérence. À l'époque étudiée ici, tout cela n'apparaît pas encore clairement. Et on peut, par exemple, les maronites pouvaient par exemple aspirer à être colonisés par la France. Les musulmans de Chypre pouvaient se placer sous la protection de l'occupant britannique à partir de 1880 pour préserver leurs droits face aux Grecs. Les Karamanleux, qui sont évoqués par le regretté Kleriotis, pouvaient se penser en citoyens ottomans et adhérer à une forme d'hellénisme différente que celui qui s'est imposé finalement et qui les a menés à l'expulsion en 1922. Donc, les contributions du livre montrent à quel point la pensée nationale, la conscience identitaire, s'est forgée dans l'exil et au contact d'autres sociétés. Mais en même temps, ça montre que personne n'échappe à des idées venues de l'extérieur. Même si le livre est prudent sur ce sujet, il aboutit à la démonstration qu'il n'y a pas vraiment de pensée autochtone, n'en déplaise aux historiens du Sud, dont certains sont cités dans le livre. Même s'il ne s'agit pas d'une simple reproduction d'une pensée élaborée ailleurs, on voit bien que tout le monde doit se déterminer par rapport à des questionnaires élaborés à l'extérieur, et on peut dire élaborés au nord, en particulier à partir des grands centres intellectuels et politiques du moment. Et l'idée même de l'autochtonie, comme pour le Tunisien, le Libyen qui circule, disons que l'idée même d'autochtonie se pense dans l'interaction et dans le mimétisme. Alors parmi ces idées qui apparaissent un peu partout dans le livre et en général au XIXe siècle, c'est l'idée du retard et de la nécessité de se civiliser, qui justifie l'impérialisme français ou anglais, mais qui est largement partagée par les acteurs évoqués ici. Et on voit par exemple le terme de régénération courir à travers l'ouvrage. Alors ce terme, pour moi, est un terme qui évoque un usage sur un temps long, puisqu'il est déjà utilisé à l'égard des chrétiens orientaux, censés se régénérer au contact des missionnaires catholiques à partir du XVIIe siècle, puis au contact des missionnaires protestants à partir du début du XIXe. Notons qu'on retrouve aussi ce thème de la régénération dans le projet missionnaire de l'Alliance israélite universelle, projet universaliste et méditerranéen, sous la tutelle de l'impérialisme français, qui devra lui aussi s'effacer face au nationalisme sioniste à partir du début du XXe siècle. Et donc on retrouve cette notion de régénération aussi dans la pensée nationaliste grecque, turque, arménienne ou arabe. Alors chacun est amené à réfléchir sur son retard et sur les moyens de son développement. Les voyageurs exilés sont aux avant-postes pour développer ses pensées. En lisant le livre, j'ai pensé aussi au Cheikh Tartawi, qui visite la France en 1830 et qui devient ensuite le modernisateur de l'Égypte kédiviale. Boutros Boustany, dans l'article Civilisation de son encyclopédie en arabe, date précisément le retard des Arabes sur l'Europe, je crois, de 4 siècles, en les situant sur une échelle de civilisation qui va des peuples primitifs de l'Océanie à la France et à l'Angleterre. Mais quand Boutros Boustany écrit ça, on est déjà en train de sortir de cette façon de penser. Vers la fin du siècle, on passe de l'idée d'une civilisation à l'idée de civilisation au pluriel. Ce n'est plus la civilisation, c'est les civilisations. Et dans le monde arabe, on se met alors, après la conquête de l'Égypte par les Anglais et l'occupation de la Tunisie par les Français, on se met à s'opposer à l'occidentalisation. Il y a un terme qui a été forgé en arabe pour ça, qui s'appelle tafarrouj, le fait de faire le front, de faire le flange, de vouloir imiter les Occidentaux. Et donc on vante au contraire la civilisation des Arabes. Mais là, paradoxe, pour vanter la civilisation des Arabes, eh bien, on va recourir encore à un ouvrage occidental, c'est Gustave Le Bon, La civilisation des Arabes, 1884, qui est fondé sur une idée de race, et qui reste jusqu'à aujourd'hui un best-seller dans le monde arabe, une référence principale. Alors je m'arrête là-dessus en disant que votre livre pourrait aussi entrer en dialogue ou en controverse avec la fameuse thèse d'Edward Said, ou du moins de l'usage qu'on en a fait. Je crois qu'Edward Said n'est pas cité. Je suis un peu étonné, puisque généralement on le met à toutes les sauces, mais peut-être c'est mieux de le laisser tranquille. Bon, en tout cas, je trouve qu'il n'y a pas ici une pensée et un savoir orientaliste seulement au service de l'impérialisme britannique ou français. On voit que cette pensée et ce savoir irrigue à peu près tout le monde par différents canaux qui ne sont pas non plus directement, disons, de la puissance impérialiste subordonnée. C'est un peu plus compliqué que ça.
Merci beaucoup. So it's my pleasure now to introduce a dear colleague from Stanford University, Ali Yaycioglu, whose name I still struggle with. Ali Yaycioglu. He's, as I said, a professor at Stanford. His research is on the Ottoman world from the 15th to the early 20th centuries. He's interested in topics such as the transformation of political and economic institutions, patterns of public and private life, forms of violence and order, movements of ideas, objects and people, production of space, spatial imaginations. And his first book, Partners of the Empire, Crisis of the Ottoman Order in the Age of Revolutions, is about to appear in 2 weeks' time. We have to have another seminar on that. And it's an attempt to rethink the Ottoman experience within the global context of the revolutionary age in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And he's working now on a project tentatively entitled Order of Volatility, Wealth, Power and Death in the Ottoman Empire, which is analyzing how insecurity of property rights, risks of political lives shaped the Ottoman order as well as the attitude of the people within it from the 15th to the mid-19th centuries. He's also working on an edited volume on spatiality in the Ottoman world, entitled Ottoman Topologies, Production of Space in an Early Modern Empire.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I would like to start with commemorate my dear friend unveils, who wrote a marvelous article, and he passed away last year.
It was his last piece.
His last piece in this book. We also would like to perhaps commemorate Chris Bailey. Actually, we also died the same year, and we dedicated to him. I read the book I just completed yesterday, and I immediately think that this is a very, very important book. And I also think that, okay, why don't I assign it in class?
Great idea.
It's an important book for many reasons, for multiple fields, for multiple ways, and I couldn't mention all of them. But I would like to say a few things about what is going on in the fields past 10, 15 years maybe, and how this book can contribute to that. And we know that in past 20, 15 years, scholars start to think that, okay, the nation state as a category cannot explain history. We cannot really limit our research within the nation state. Okay, why not empires? So we have this imperial turn. People start thinking, scholars of the Mediterranean particularly thinking empires more thoroughly. But then again, they say, well, the empires cannot explain everything. Empires cannot be explained within empires. There are other things going on. There are all kinds of other networks, markets, connections, groups, individuals crossing empires, and they might be very important, even to understand how the empires, took shape and transformed. So, last 10 years, we we have seen several books on individuals or groups, networks, diasporic communities, people in between, particularly in the Mediterranean context. Clarence Simmet's book on refugees and migration from North Africa to France, Natalie Rothman, translators, and in between Italy, Venice, Andres Arsans, actually he also has a marvelous piece, Lebanese Diaspora, Trivelatov, book on Livorno, Paula Finland's book on the objects, the circulation of the objects, Ian Coller's book, The Arabs in France, Ilham Makdisi's book on the anarchists in the Mediterranean, and Wolfgang Kaiser's projects, The Muslims in Europe, and these are some examples of this growing field. And I think the underlying idea here is really from the early modern period, from the 15th, 16th centuries, we can see two major trends. One is, okay, the consolidation of the states, empires. Definitely, empires became much more rigorous, bureaucratization, land codes, you name it. But there were also more interactions. So we have to understand these two trends together, interactions, connections, diasporic communities, networks, as well as the imperial buildings and state building. How can we combine these two trends together? I think this explains what early modern was, globalization at the same time, new state building processes. In this respect, this book would contribute to that growing literature. It focused on intellectuals and intellectual circulation of ideas, and also it focused on diasporic communities. So, in many ways, the articles tell us what is the kind of a diasporic condition, what would be in the diasporic condition, and how that condition would be an advantage for intellectuals, because then they might be connected to various elements, and they were also perhaps able to liberate themselves from their homelands. I mean, homelands are probably the term for diasporic communities, but you know what I mean. So this diasporic condition, I suppose, here is the underlining criteria, and I think in this respect it gives lots of interesting insights. And also, as earlier speakers mentioned the biographical element, the individual stories, and how different individuals experience that 19th century, and how they somehow be part of that story. And by focusing on biographical material, we can see all very large repertoire of possibilities, as you also mentioned. So I want to raise two questions that kind of puzzles, and perhaps these puzzles might also push us to think what is after this, where to go, if you will, after these contributions. Okay, was this really a kind of a Mediterranean context, an intellectual, was really the Mediterranean as a context of intellectual exchange? The answer seems to be yes. Okay. But then what were the other competing, complementing zones, or maybe more decisive, more important, perhaps, larger geographical context for intellectual exchange? I think we should really keep this question in mind. Mark Mazover told me once that if you make an argument, you have to make a counter-argument in your own argument, so that your argument will be more powerful. So what would be the alternative? What would be the other other larger context, intellectual geographies, which might complement, compete, challenge the Mediterranean, or which might give us a different perspective. One thing about the Ottoman world. So when I look at the Ottoman intellectual culture from the 17th, 16th to the end of 19th century, mid-19th century, what I find, in fact, it is not easy to see, to kind of notice strong parallelisms in political language, political concepts, political vocabulary. So, for instance, there are articles in the book about liberalism in the early 19th century, the liberal term, international liberal. You look at the Ottoman context, you don't see them. You only see them by 1850s, 1870s, they start to appear. But before that, it's like when you just look at the just sheer political vocabulary concepts, you don't see very strong parallelisms. So what does it mean? First of all, why this turning point happened in somehow 19th century? So what happened so that people started to speak the same language? What's the role of the diasporic communities, intellectuals in that term? Was it just a westernization, or there was something else going on for the Ottoman Empire? For the earlier period, can we think about the kind of another level of analysis for the early 19th century, so that we can see the Ottoman political, intellectual life and intellectual currents, and current intellectual currents in Spain, Italy, France, so that they are kind of commensurable. Maybe we cannot use the term liberalism, but maybe there's another term that we can think of, so that certain currents in the Ottoman world and certain currents in France might be commensurable and parallel, or at least can speak to each other. Then what were these terms? So these are some ideas, and then I thought about another question. Okay, the Ottoman context, the Ottoman world, can be by itself a kind of an intellectual space, but then obviously the Balkans, the Greece, we have to think about them. You know, the Christians in the Ottoman Empire, all other connections, Greek Enlightenment. But then I said, okay, Konstantina wrote about the Russian Mediterranean. I immediately talk about the Afghan Mediterranean. So why I thought about Afghan Mediterranean? Because I know that in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Afghans were extremely visible in the Mediterranean world. And the Uzbeks, there was a huge Uzbek Naqshbandi network from Bukhara, to Vidin, from Vidin to Crete. There's in Crete there was a Uzbek tekkesi, the Uzbek lodge, the Naqshbandi lodge. And in the latest part of the 19th century, they are very visible throughout the Maghreb. Recently, there are two books came out. They're very interesting. Just this year. One is by Shahab Ahmed, my dear colleague. We also lost him, unfortunately, this year, from Harvard. This book is a major book. It's entitled "What is Islam?" Shahab Ahmed. And the other is, again, a colleague from Harvard, Khalid al-Ruhayyab, and this is a 17th century Ottoman intellectual history. So two books. And both of them are focusing on early modern Ottoman intellectual, Islamic intellectual life. And they came up with completely different positions, perspectives. Shahab Ahmed thought that the decisive intellectual space for the Islamic world is what he called the Balkan-Bengal complex. So he thought that there is this kind of a zone, intellectual zone, which was constituted by the circulation of books and intellectuals and scholars from the Adriatic to Bengal. And this is more a kind of a Turco-Persianate world. So they read the same poets, they read the same political material, political theory, if you will. They knew each other, they collected each other's books. And it's more a Turco-Persianate world. It's part of also the Mediterranean world, as you see. And Halit el-Ruhayeb, he said, no, he talked about a different world. It is a Turco-Arabo-Turkic world, if you like. From Morocco to Anatolia to the Balkans, which also included certain elements in the Indian Ocean. And Senghor talked about, the Indian Ocean connections from, there's certain circulation of books from Malacca to Arabia, Africa, East Africa, from East Africa to all the way to Morocco. What is El-Ruhayeb is working on is mainly logic. So the books on logic and logicians were connected in a different way from Morocco to the Balkans and then all the way to Malacca. Still in the 18th century, 19th century, maybe not. And then for Shah Ahmed, even in the mid-19th century, there is another space from the Balkans to Bengal. So, how can these two larger intellectual zones can be meaningful for us in the Mediterranean context? I want to finish with one example of one biography, short biography, and then it can give you some. Can enrich. Jamaluddin al-Afghani. Jamaluddin al-Afghani is a very well-known Islamic reformist. For some people, he's really the founder of modernist Islam. Some people thought that he's a neoconservative in an Islamic context. Some people thought he's a liberal Islamic scholar, liberal Islamic ideologue. So there's still a kind of there's no agreement about what he was, but he's a really a very important figure, and he's also the masters of two major figures of the modern Islamist movement, Muhammad Abdul and Rashid Rida. So and his story is very interesting. He was born in Iran. Then he went to Afghanistan in Kandahar. He was graduating in Kandahar in the madrasas. His youth was in Kandahar. Then he moved to Istanbul, lived there for a while. And then he moved to Egypt. He was a professor at Al-Azhar for a while. Then Mecca, Medina. Then he went to India for a while. He spent 2 years in India. Then he came back to Egypt, and then he took the boat to Marseille. Then he went to Paris. He lived in Paris good 2-3 years. Very lively in his biographies, Paris years. And he was a very important figure. He was very visible in the Parisian circles. Then he went to London. And he was very much involved in the Muslims in India. There's all this discussion about the British Empire. Then he back to Iran. Then
in the 1870s,
he was born in 1839. He died in 97. From Iran to Russia. He was involved in all this Muslim question of Russian Empire, especially in Kazan. Back to Iran, he was one of the organizers of the tobacco protests against the Great Britain, and he died in Istanbul. He's maybe a little bit, too much kind of a traveler kind, but we know that he's not the only one. There are a good many people coming from Kashgar. I know one guy from Kashgar, actually. He ended the Ottoman Empire, and then he died in Morocco. So there's that corridor that we should consider very, very seriously, I suppose, especially in the 18th, 19th centuries. If we somehow want to understand the picture more rigorous, sadly the empires shouldn't be understood within, right? So it was the Mediterranean, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final commentator, is Antonis Liakos. He's a historian, professor emeritus at the University of Athens, managing editor of the Historical Review Historian, and he's recent chair of the board of the International Commission for History and Theory of Historiography. His main fields of research are indeed history of historiography, the theory of history, historical culture, and he has written broadly on the idea of Italian unification, on labour and politics in interwar Greece, on modern Greek historiography, historiography in Southeast Europe after socialism, on history and tolerance, Hellenism and the making of modern Greece, and more recently, the past as utopia, or the desire for history. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Although the officiality of the change, I think that the discussion is a sequel of the discussion we had in Andros, in a Mediterranean, rocky and windy island with Konstantina and Maurizio many times, many summers there, swimming and drinking raki. So, and from another aspect, is also a sequel of my discussion with Konstantinos Iridotou, who is working on Korais, another itinerant intellectual between Smyrna and Paris and Amsterdam. So, I think that this book is important because it's questioning a series of dualisms between empire and nation, between religion and enlightenment, revolution and counter-revolution, Eastern and Western mentalities, and unravels some of the most enduring stereotypes of European intellectual history from the Napoleonic and post-Napoleonic era. First, this book investigates the open possibilities of these phenomena, exploring their regional and national variations across the Mediterranean, and not only the Mediterranean, between Russia and London and other parts of Europe. But second, it shows with clarity that the national consciousness was a transnational phenomenon and explore its making not as a linear line, but as a puzzle. It explored the initial stages of the creation of the national consciousness as a transitional, transnational, and diasporic phenomenon. Third, doesn't presuppose an existing national body, but it sees the national consciousness as an interaction between diasporas. The term diaspora is worth to understand in this book outside the division between native land, patria, and migration, between center and periphery. With the words of the writers, it is not the sense to produce their diasporas, but rather diasporas reinvent the concept of the nation, or diasporas as the extension of the centers. But this new understanding of diaspora should be given to the term a social distinction. Diaspora is the word of intellectuals and literary people. If we have understand that, then we could proceed the role of those diasporic intellectuals not only as the producers and the diffusers of ideas and emotions, but also as bridges with the not yet nationalized mass. Their activity as literary persons, journalists, editors, translators, schoolmasters, and so on, could be understood through their role of bridging the prehistory and the history of the nations. All of them stand across this borderline. Two examples: Karolidis and Emanuelidis. Between their Turkish-speaking fellow countrymen and Greek and aspiring Greek and Ottoman citizenry met in Smyrna, a kind of border town, border city in those two words. And their role of bridge, being in Greece, Emanuelidis and Karolidis, after the exchange of population, they were the mediators of Hellenizing this Turkish-speaking population of Karamanlis to becoming them as Greek citizens. The other example, Girolamo de Rada and the Sanseddin Sami Fraseri. Both of them envisioning the future of the Albanian nation, the one from Calabria of Italy and the other from Istanbul, seeing at the same time Albanian cultural identity and Ottoman national citizenship, and bridging them, and translating also French works to Turkish. So this kind of complex role, it was addressing not only in the circle of intellectuals, but also in their fellow citizens, to produce them as the subject of their aspiring national ideas. So this role of bridge should be emphasized. This work also overcomes the teleology of modern European intellectual history between the empire and the nation. And it is a strong teleology of this kind of procedure, from empires or pre-modern states to the modern national state. The case, for example, of Hassouna Advigiz from Tripolis of Libya is an example of this crooked line between the national ideas and the support of the empire towards having to affront this kind of colonialism in front of the North African. It changed also, this book, the geographical connotations of the Mediterranean region. Instead of an approach that sees the phenomena as a radiation between Western Europe and the periphery, or in the Said version as the Orientalism and the neocolonialism and the colonialism, the work proposed a new geography of different traditions and positions between the Mediterranean, Northern Europe, the Ottoman world, including Maghreb, Egypt, and Syria, in the orbit of nationalism. And this is important, and I think that, as far as I know, it's a new approach to incorporate national ideas and liberal ideas of the southern and eastern coast of the Mediterranean to the whole landscape. It explores also the middle ground between revolution and counter-revolution. And the article of Konstantina Zanou about the intellectuals of the Ionian Islands, influenced by Enlightenment, but having a kind of counter-revolution social position, and so aligned with Russia. It's a beautiful example of this middle ground, and how this middle ground produce intellectual space, but also political, concrete political results. So this attempt to see Mediterranean in the era of nationalism as a space beyond the division of Northern and European Mediterranean and Southern and African Mediterranean countries, it's one of the most strong features of this book. Another strong characteristic of this volume is that presents in new and innovative ways the circulation of ideas through the trajectories of moving people in the Mediterranean and beyond. From this point of view, this book connects the experience of historical personalities with the historical changes of their time history, and is coming closer from the space of ideas that we used to describe as historians in the last years to the space of experience, from the ideas to experience. I believe that this volume will have a great impact into the film of the Mediterranean study from this point of view, because it connects what's happened in social history, from ideas to experience, from the facts to experience, to the field of the Mediterranean studies, to the area studies. I'd like also to add a last word for the style of writing of most chapters, which is the style of storyteller. And I like this style. And this is fairly attractive because it organizes the book around the cases of life stories. It is also an open-ended book. It's not kind of ended in this book. It's open in this book with other stories that we have heard here in this panel. I'd like also to emphasize that it's also a book of open narratives where instead of the national teleology, contingency plays the prime role. So it is the track, contingency. I would say that this work makes a non-conventional intellectual history following different paths that the established pattern in the period from the Enlightenment to national romanticism, stressing the diasporic element in constituting ideologies, and this way brings in life many silenced voices and also frustrated aspirations. Many stories did not come advanced as true projects. But closing this book, I would like to say that we are observing now Mediterranean also in movement. 19th century, it was people from the southern of Europe, from the north of the Mediterranean, going to the south with the African coast of the Mediterranean, working, doing commerce and things like that. But now we are observing a mass exodus from the south of the Mediterranean to the north of the Mediterranean. An exodus constituting new diasporas. We see also Mediterranean as a sea of the dead bodies. And we see the spectrum of terrorism, jihadism, and these kind of ideologies that we have somehow traced in their origins to Al-Afghani and these intellectuals of this time as a spectre around the Mediterranean and not only around Europe. But in this Mediterranean of today, there are itineraries and life stories, many life stories, that are similar to the stories were narrated in this book. I've met someone, for example, recently in Athens, coming from Maghreb, going to Libya to work during Gaddafi regime, then to Anatolia, then to Syria, and from Syria as a refugee to Anatolia, Turkey, and then passing to Greece, and from Greece aspiring to go to Central Europe. Or I have another friend, Salman Kami, who is coming from Afghanistan, living 6 years in Iran, then passing to Turkey, then coming in Greece, learning perfectly Greek, and then refugee in Amsterdam, in Holland. What kind of ideas these people is circulating around? This is something like seeing the story from the today story of circulating persons in Mediterranean, and I'm imagining those persons, imagining us talking about the past of the circulations of persons in Mediterranean, what they have said. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me thank our 4 commentators for their very rich presentations. Now I'm wondering how the editors will respond.
Yes.
So they will do so relatively briefly, and then we'll open the floor for discussion.
Can I start with just 4 points, very quickly? Thank you all. It has been really wonderful to hear all these things that I have never thought about this book, actually, and thank you very much. So I think what comes out, I will just comment on 4 issues. The first is that this book saw the Mediterranean as a question. We were wondering, what is the Mediterranean? We do not think that the Mediterranean is defined here, neither geographically. So it means that the Mediterranean can expand to Russia, to Afghanistan. It's an open space. So we haven't tried to do a history of the Mediterranean, but a history in the Mediterranean and beyond. So the question remains open. What is the Mediterranean, and until and where does it stop? We don't know where it stops. The second feature of the Mediterranean, of our Mediterranean in a certain sense, is very timely, because against Brodel, let's say the Brodelian image of the Mediterranean, which is it's abstract and immobile. Our Mediterranean is full of bodies and lives and people, specific small lives of people. So in a certain sense, this was the second element, which brings to the question of the biography, which I wanted to comment by saying what Antonis said about the element of experience, because I believe that the biographical approach is important, not as much as exemplary, as if these individuals are exemplary for what was happening, but because it's a key to arrive to a human experience of history, which is the way myself I experience history and understand it. So I found a very comfortable key in order to approach certain issues of that work through biography and through experience. So the second point that I want to make is about diasporas. This is also a book which tried to reconceptualize the meaning of the diasporas. So especially arguing that we are moving from a perception of the diaspora with capital D as as the diaspora that we know, which is lost from a center, let's say, to the diasporas, which means not the old way of perceiving diasporas, diasporic communities, which live organized but away from the nation state, but as people dispersed here and there, which create even the very sense of the diaspora. So, and this brings in another big issue that we had to face. What is mobility? What is place? What is mobility? And what is exile in that period? When I started my research, I thought that exile was something taken for granted. No, it was like political exile, usually. With the passing of time, I realized that some people, without even moving, they became exiles because the geography was moving around them. So we see different geographies, cultural and political geographies of the Mediterranean, moving, but older geographies persist through the new geographies. So the guys of the Ionian Islands I studied, for example, they were people who were part of the Venetian Empire and the Venetian culture, and when this collapsed, and they became part of the Russian Empire and then the British Empire and then of the Greek state, the same people, in a lifetime, okay? These people continued to go to Italy to study it. So they, in a certain sense, they lived within the dead geographies of the Venetian Empire, but now they were exiles from the Greek state, which was being created. They didn't change anything from their way of life. They became exiles. So, not only what is the Mediterranean, but what is exile, what is diaspora, what is space, what is movement. Just a last comment to say that this is also a book about the Enlightenments, in a certain sense. The Enlightenments and their relationship to revolution and counter-revolution and religion. So it tried to kind of complicate the picture between what we know as the major elements of Enlightenment and their relationship to revolution, to the age of revolutions. And by unearthing some figures who were Enlightenment thinkers, but who were counter-revolutionaries because they lived in a counter-revolutionary era, the Restoration period, and so they believed in the Enlightenment values for the amelioration of society, but they were totally counter-revolutionary, but they were nationalists. So we see more complicated stories.
Yes, well, thank you very much for your first of all, for reading the collection so carefully and with such sort of stimulating comments. I'll try to sum up a few sort of general reactions to what you said about a collection, of course, that was inspired, at least in the case of half of the contributors, and I really want to mention him now, by the work and the methodological revolution of Christopher Bailey, who actually read this collection and sent me the endorsement to it 3 days before dying. And a number of the contributors also worked closely with him, including me, and had an intellectual dialogue with him. So, in fact, I'm glad you raised the question of what is globalization, you know, is a global approach contradicted by the book? Where is Said in all of this? Well, I think that the global approach in intellectual history is not an approach about creating sort of global motorways of uniformities. It's actually the opposite of it. It's opening up to the possibility of transnational connections that are unexpected because we're not used to thinking about that because of these kind of national prejudices in our historiographies. And it's also, the global approach, it's not just about convergence, but also divergence. It's about fights and disagreements. So the liberal international, as I conceived it when I use it, it's not a space of uniformity, but it's a space of dialogue, but also harsh disagreements and divisions. This is why I don't think that the book goes against the premise of global history, but actually fits into this approach. Also, the relevance that all the thinkers that we cover in the book demonstrate for European debates is not against this approach. What we question, I think, all of us in this book, first of all, is the derivative nature of the debates of people thinking around the Mediterranean. What these people do is that they engage with what is said and published in London and Paris. They have a dialogue with Bentham, they have a dialogue with Benjamin Constant, they have a dialogue with Voltaire, but their work is not, and these are not derivative. This is what we don't like. To imagine them to study the radiation of ideas from Paris to the rest of the world. Paris is very important, but what these people do is not just to imitate Paris, it's to engage creatively with it. It's also, we also are dissatisfied implicitly with the post-colonial language of resistance and subordination or subjugation. These people are not passive victims of colonialism. They are trying to make sense of the world as it is unfolding around them. And of course they are in a position that is geopolitically weaker, and this is why sometimes they think that the French expansion in North Africa is an opportunity to advance their ideas, and sometimes they think it's not working, then we need to go in a different route, we need to re-strengthen the Ottoman Empire. They are in a world, the Mediterranean of the 19th century, that is a weak place, that is confronted with expansion, with colonialism, with decision taken somewhere else, but they're not intellectually weak. They're not passive people. So this I feel very strongly, and I think this is what the book is trying to say. And also, so it is, going back to Ali's question, I think it is a book not just about the Mediterranean, it's a book about Europe. It is a book about Europe because it forces us to think about Europe in different terms. To give you an example, to deconstruct our idea of what Europe is, this book shows the importance of Italy, or even of Piedmont for some of these individuals. Fazi Ali Pasha, discussed by Andrew Arson, looks at Piedmont as a success case, and he says, you know, we need to imitate Piedmont to have a stronger Ottoman Empire. Having a dialogue, for instance, with Ilampuri Makdisi, she told me how much in the press of the Syrian emigres at the end of the 19th century, and again, traditional labels of intellectual history do not make sense of this kind of miscellaneous composition of anarchist, socialist, liberal ideas that they used to reform the empire. How important in their writings Garibaldi is. Garibaldi is a revolutionary, but these reformers consider him as an icon. We need to rethink intellectual history when we look at these debates because our traditional language is not adequate. We also need to integrate regional studies with other regional studies. I think this is the way forward, and this is what the global agenda invites us to do. So we need to have a book about the Black Sea as the center and how it connects with the rest of the world around it, or with the Indian Ocean and its connection with the Mediterranean, or about the relationship between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. We need lots of regional books that help us slowly to build a global map. It will take a lot of time. We need to rethink also our language to do intellectual history. It's not easy, and it's an open process. Perhaps a way of bringing together the various debates that this book presents, including the ones by Ottoman thinkers from the very beginning of the 19th century, is to drop the term liberal, which was not used by all of them, and see the Constitution as a central problem. The Constitution is something that most of these reformers want, but what the Constitution means can be very different things, can apply to very different contexts, can apply to an empire, can apply to local autonomy within an empire, can be the defense of ancient privileges, can be the introduction of human rights. It can mean many different things. So maybe Constitution is a way of thinking about 19th century intellectual history in a Mediterranean context. That's all I wanted to say, but thank you very much, all of you, for your comments.